Hello, this is Matthew from The Sociology Show, and before you listen to the upcoming interview with Dr. Claire Sedgwick, I just wanted to go through a few details about the show. So firstly, I am planning to run a Q&A podcast in the next few weeks. I've had several emails come through to me about a variety of different things, most of them from students who are studying sociology for the first time. But this is going to be an open Q&A session for anyone. So if you have any question to do with anything to do with sociology, please do send it through to the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, or you can send the message through on the Twitter account as well. And also, if you're not yet following the Twitter account, then please do just search for The Sociology Show and you'll be able to find us on there. What I'd like to do is read out the question. Anything that you've sent through, you can either put your name on it or you can keep it anonymous, and I will give you an answer. So if you are studying sociology for the first time, or there's something in sociology you're not understanding, there's a theory or a key term that you're not understanding, please do send that through and I'll have a go answering those for you. You have probably got questions that a lot of other sociology students are thinking as well. So if you're a little bit too embarrassed to ask your teacher or a lecturer and you want to send that through, then please do that. The second point that I'd like to talk about is for if you're a teacher or a lecturer and you're listening to the show. I have some posters for you to put up in your classrooms and lecture theatres. So if you would like a poster, then please do email the same address, the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, or get in touch on Twitter and I'll be able to send on a poster for you. It's just nothing fancy, but it's something that you can print out and maybe laminate and put up in your classroom. So if you do want one of those, please do get in touch. The third point that I wanted to talk about was guests. I've had a few requests of people that you would like me to interview. I will do my very best. If there is someone that you're really, really interested to hear from, someone that fascinates you, assuming they are still alive, by the way. I've had a few requests of people who've died. Sorry, I can't interview Durkheim or Marx or Weber. Apologies about that. But if there is a living sociologist, professor, doctor, academic, someone that you would like me to talk to, then please do send me who you would like to talk to. I'll try and get in touch with them. I will do my very best. There are a few big names that I am hoping that will be coming up on the show soon. I can't announce them yet. The only one that I have got definitely coming up is the second part with Angela McRobbie, which I'm hoping to record soon. So you can look forward to that one. But as I said, anyone else that you would like me to talk to, then please do send that request through. The fourth point that I'd like to talk about is I'm potentially going to be running a psychology show podcast to run in line with the Sociology Show podcast. If you would like to have some of your interviews on the Psychology Show podcast, then please do get in touch. I'm looking for you to interview anyone within the world of psychology. Interviews tend to be between 30 minutes and 45 minutes, and they can be on any topics you like. The ones that are most popular are those that would be of interest to particularly A-level students. That seems to be the most popular episodes, but actually I'm open to any different ideas. So if you would like to be involved in any way on the Psychology Show podcast coming soon, then please do get in touch. And finally, if you have yet to subscribe to the show, please do so. I can see that many people are downloading week by week, but actually the number of people subscribing is not as high as the number of people that are downloading. If you do subscribe, it just means that you don't have to find the show each time, and it's just automatically downloaded for you whenever there's a release. And also, if you are prompted to give the show a review, please, if you can, give it a 5-star review, give it a little comment. It helps me move up the charts. So if someone does search on Google, for example, for Sociology Podcast, it would be nice to try and get this show up to the top. And as always, you probably had the adverts, but if you can spare even a small amount, then please do donate on the GoFundMe page. That is just for me to be able to pay for the hosting costs, which are quite expensive. It takes me a long time to put together all of these different episodes. As you can imagine, to edit them all and host them all is quite costly. So if you can spare even a small amount to help keep the show going, then please do find the Sociology Show on GoFundMe page. So without further ado, let's go over to the episode with Dr. Claire Sedgwick on the Sociology Show podcast. Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Dr. Claire Sedgwick from the University of Nottingham, and Claire is the author of Feminist Media, From the Second Wave to the Digital Age. Claire, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I just gave a little bit of an introduction. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a researcher. My background is really in feminist media studies. So my PhD, which is what the book that you mentioned is based on, was on the way that feminism was represented within the kind of second wave in feminist publications, so primarily Spare in the UK and Ms in the US. But what came out of that project was a really interesting kind of thinking about less to do with the media itself, but more who gets to create certain kinds of media, whose voices are heard versus whose voices are kind of silence, and which I think made me think a bit more about how that can be seen in other kinds of contexts. So the book is very much based on my PhD, but my most recent project in a lot of ways feels a bit left field because it's looking at stand-up comedy and kind of issues of precarity. But I think it comes out of that same place of being really interested in who gets to speak and how certain kind of privileges or disadvantages make that more difficult for some people than for others.
Excellent, great. And we'll talk a little bit more about your current research in a moment. Where did sociology start for you, Claire? Did you do it at GCSE or A-level?
No, I didn't even do a degree. So I'm a very odd kind of, so I would probably describe myself as a cultural sociologist, and I very much kind of a lot of affinity with the kind of cultural studies tradition of kind of the Birmingham school and so on. But yeah, my background is completely not traditionally sociological. So I did a BA and an MA in English literature, but I was very lucky that I did a course that was very grounded in kind of reading the text that we looked at contextually. So actually a lot of the stuff that I learned about sociology came from doing an English degree. And then I did a PhD in feminist media studies. But again, I was looking more at the sociological side. So it very much comes from, I very much feel like a bit of a kind of insider outsider in sociology. Like it very much feels like something that I identify with. But as I said, I've got no formal training in the subject.
And you mentioned feminism is obviously a key part of your work. Who was your kind of inspiration? Was there any particular feminists or writers that kind of inspired your own writing?
Yeah, so I remember when I was doing my undergraduate, I started reading people like Angela McRobbie and really feeling like, that feeling like a kind of door was opening. Because I think a lot of the stuff that I'd been reading, it was more kind of theoretical, had previously been a lot of kind of, if I'm going to be very honest, a lot of old dead white men. So it was quite interesting to start reading stuff that was more contemporary and that was actually written in a style that I could kind of grasp quite quickly and that really resonated with my own experiences, which I hadn't necessarily had when I was reading things like kind of, when I was reading about semiotics, for example. It's very difficult to kind of place yourself within that quite as easily. So yeah, so McRobbie was really kind of one of the first kind of feminist theorists that I was like, oh wow, yeah, I completely understand. And then kind of Ros Gill as well. And then I remember reading Audre Lorde and reading the Master's Tools Can Never Dismantle Master's House, and just again thinking like that really helps clear up a lot of the things that I've been thinking about, the relationship between what we can be as feminists with the kind of world that we live in, and the fact that sometimes there is that kind of weird tension where, we want to try and do things in a certain way that works within the existence, how successful can we be? So I think, yes, feminism is kind of the foundation to everything that I've done as an academic, really.
Yeah, and at the Angela McRobbie episode that we recorded for this has been one of the most popular. I think it's probably in the top 3 most downloaded episodes. So she's definitely very much appreciated.
Yeah, and as I said, just reading. So I read The Aftermath of Feminism not long after it came out, and just been like, because obviously I was doing my degree at a time when a lot of the discussion around feminism was quite kind of, we were coming out of that backlash idea of feminism where we were kind of saying, oh, well, we don't really need feminism anymore. Like women have got equality. So to read something that kind of made me realise that my own beliefs weren't actually that weird, and actually kind of it was fine to kind of not just accept what I was being told was like equality and opportunity was really refreshing.
Yeah. So Claire, what I thought we'd do is we'd talk about the book that I mentioned at the start, and then we'll go into a little bit more, talk about your work to do with comedy. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your book, Feminist Media?
Yeah, so the book, as I said, it comes out of my PhD. So the idea of it was to look at the ways in which feminist media represented feminism itself. So the kind of catalyst for it was partly the fact that a lot of discussions of kind of second wave feminism, so this kind of feminism between the 70s and kind of the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of kind of assumptions made about what that feminism represented, what those feminists believed, but there wasn't a huge amount of work that was actually based on readings of text from that period. So I think there was a lot of kind of assumptions that were made. So I thought it would be a really helpful thing to go back and actually look at what people were saying at the time. Because I think that often, and Claire Hemmings talks about this in her work, there's often a way that sometimes feminists get pitted against each other. So we often talk about second wave feminists, but then the third wave came along and feminists were much more kind of sophisticated and we're talking about different things. But what I found actually is that there was a lot of kind of continuation. So a lot of the things that we were talking about in the 70s, we could pick out the kind of articles that I looked at and drop them in a blog today, and they wouldn't look out of place. So what I really wanted to think about is how we can draw a tradition of feminist media and think about how they're kind of linked to each other. But also think about the ways that certain women and certain voices have been historically and are currently excluded from kind of feminist discourses, especially in kind of feminist media.
And could we just, for clarification, you mentioned second wave, we tend to think of 60s, 70s. When do you define third wave? And also, sub-question, because some people now talk about fourth wave feminism, kind of digital feminism. Would you just clarify what you kind of consider the waves to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky one. And in the book, I kind of say that these are quite helpful terms to use. We often need to have kind of periods we need to describe periods in history in order to kind of talk about them. They are quite disputed terms. We'd normally say, the second wave would normally last until the late 80s. And we'd normally say the third wave would be from the kind of early 90s onwards. So in the book, I talk about Riot Girl, which was kind of like a music movement, but also they did a lot of kind of zine writing. And then we might talk about the kind of fourth wave as coming out of kind of the early 2000s where feminists started blogging, for example. But then people start talking about fifth wave feminism and it all becomes very kind of, we're going to have to get to a point where we stop, where the waves stop. But that's kind of the general wave that it's kind of been theorised. But as I said, it's a tricky one because I think we need the terms to describe it, but often it oversimplifies what is actually quite a kind of, is not this kind of up and down movement, which the wave metaphor sometimes makes it sound like.
Yeah, especially if many of the issues of second wave feminism are still prevalent now, it seems strange to distinctively put them in, in terms of that's been solved. We need to move on to something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's historically been the way that it's been kind of viewed. And I think some of that is to do with feminists responding to the backlash in the kind of late 80s where people were saying, oh, we don't need feminism anymore, and having to kind of respond against that. But as I said, a lot of the debates that people were having then, we are very much still having today. So it's, I think it's useful to think of it more as a kind of, as a cyclical movement than a kind of, as a linear movement.
Thank you, Claire. That's going to be the end of part one. We're going to have a short break and then carry on the discussion. Hi, welcome back. I'm talking to Dr. Claire Sedgwick. We were just talking about your book, The Feminist Media, From the Second Wave to the Digital Age. I was interested, Claire, about your kind of methodology, how you collected your data.
Yeah, so it looks at so for the stuff that was more historical, I looked at a kind of quite a wide sample of articles from the two magazines that I picked. So I picked Spare Rib and Ms. So Spare Rib was a magazine that was UK based that lasted until the early 90s. Ms is a US magazine which started in the early 70s and still exists today, but it's not as kind of, it's not published as often. It's kind of been, in some respects, being kind of overshadowed by other publications. So I looked at articles within those across a period of kind of 20 years, predominantly to look at the kind of key issues that they were talking about, how they were talking about those issues, and whether that was reflected in the kind of scholarship around the kind of the period that I was looking at. For Spare Rib, I was very lucky. They digitised it, not kind of halfway through the PhD, so I could just sit at home and look at all of the issues, and that was very nice. For Ms, I had to kind of, go to the British Library or the Women's Library to look at them, which, I think is another issue with some of this research is actually it's quite labour intensive and it requires quite a lot of kind of, you need to be quite privileged to be able to kind of do that. And obviously, we're very lucky in the UK that there is a lot of places that you can look at this information, but otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do the project. And then the second half of the project looks at kind of contemporary feminist media, and most of that's on the internet. But what's interesting about that is one of my sample websites, XOJane. It's quite, it was being published in the last 10 years or so, but they got bought out by another kind of media company who then decided to completely scrub the whole website. So I had to use the Wayback Machine to get to it, which I thought was interesting because you would anticipate some of these problems with the kind of more traditional physical archive. But I think sometimes we assume that if something's on the internet, then it's there forever. Yes. And this kind of quickly taught me that that's not the case.
And so should we go into some of your kind of main findings from the research? What were the overriding factors that you identified from the research?
What I found from the kind of the more historical side of it was actually a lot of the assumptions that we make about the periods are not necessarily reflected in the discussions that were happening within the magazines. So often the magazines had a much more complex relationship with some of these topics. So, for example, I've got a chapter that looks at kind of pornography, and I think a kind of narrative that we often kind of see in discussions of kind of a move towards kind of a more feminist pornography is that we'll have this idea of kind of pornography in the, in the kind of 70s and 80s. Everyone hated it, thought it was terrible. But in the third wave, people started thinking that we could have like a feminist pornography. But what I found is actually that's not really what happened. And actually in Spare Rib in particular, what happened was pornography was being discussed in a myriad of different ways. And that the narrative about it has been kind of somewhat flattened to kind of suit this quite linear kind of idea of progressiveness that is sometimes kind of discussed. And what I also found as well is that all of the feminist texts that I looked at had this real struggle against, on the one hand, being kind of explicitly feminist, but on the other hand, existing within a kind of a publishing industry that makes that quite, that makes it quite difficult to match up some of the feminist principles that you might have with the fact that you've got to survive and kind of make, you've got to turn over a profit in order to keep going. Which again, I think is something that we kind of can see today when we look at some of the more popular forms of feminism that we see. So if you think about kind of, the way that feminism has been took up in advertising, on the one hand, we can be, we can say that's a very positive thing because it's very visible. But on the other hand, are we then commodifying feminism to the extent that actually it doesn't have any of its political bite anymore because it's seen as something that can kind of sell a product?
And I just wondered how, you talk up to the digital age, how kind of citizen journalism has impacted it. Is there a lot more opportunity for people to break away from mainstream media firms, go more independent, produce their own work?
I think that there is, but I think we have to be I think there is a tendency to talk about the internet as this very liberating space. And I think in a lot of ways it absolutely is. We can look at kind of social movements like Me Too, for example, and think about the extent to which, that allowed, millions of women to kind of talk about experiences that they may not have talked about otherwise. But we can also talk about Me Too in the fact that it was a hashtag that was set up by a Black woman that was completely overshadowed by Hollywood, to the extent to which, Tarana Burke, who coined the phrase, really had to fight to kind of become visible again within that kind of discussion. So I think there is that potential for it to be, to be quite freeing. But on the one hand, my feeling is that it also kind of reinforces existing kind of inequalities that exist, which mean that often it's white women and kind of privileged women that get to speak, and often, working class women and women of colour find it more difficult.
Yeah, and I'm just going to plug another episode actually, but Dr. Alison Phipps from the University of Sussex wrote a really good book, Me Not You, which covers that kind of issue, that it kind of gets taken over by a majority, and and then you end up with a silent group who don't get their views heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've read Alison's book, and it really encapsulates some of those issues. That feminism is obviously a movement that aims for kind of the liberation of women, but within kind of the kind of group of women, there is obviously still kind of inequalities there as well. So I think we just have to be very mindful of that, even when we're talking about feminism as a movement.
Thank you, Claire. That's going to be the end of part 2. In part 3, we're going to talk about your work to do with comedy. Hi, welcome back to the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Claire Sedgwick. Claire, you're also doing some work within stand-up comedy, is that right?
Yeah, okay. That's absolutely right. Yeah,
tell us all about that.
Yeah, so this started, like I said at the beginning, it feels a little bit kind of left field from what I did my PhD on. But it started when I was doing my PhD, I got to the final kind of term, and I was like, kind of, really struggling through the last little bit of the writing process. And the university that I was at had a comedy course that was happening. And I thought, I'm going to do it just because it'll give me something else to be really nervous about that is quite low stakes. For me, at that time, I didn't want to be a comedian. If I completely fell flat on my face, it wouldn't have really mattered compared to the PhD, which was very important to me. And I did it, and I really enjoyed it, and I carried on doing it for a little while. And then I found it really difficult to carry on because it's really time consuming.
Yes.
And actually it requires a lot of resources. And it made me think about kind of some of the discourses that have been happening within kind of cultural studies and within the cultural industries more broadly about kind of inequality. So there's been things like the panic report that came out with Arts Emergency that looked at kind of the lack of representation of working class people throughout the industry, and also work that's been done on kind of gender in the cultural industries. And it seemed to me that comedy was something that people enjoyed and did a lot of, but there was very little understanding of the barriers that were there that meant that some people found it very difficult to kind of develop a career for reasons that were little to do with talent, but were more to do with kind of lack of kind of resource. So I kind of developed that into a project that I got funding for that is in the kind of early stages that would actually involve asking stand-up comedians within the East Midlands about their experiences of kind of trying to develop a career within stand-up comedy, thinking about the kind of, the barriers to that, how they managed it alongside other kinds of work, just to see whether we can think about, first of all, what can be done within the industry to make it more kind of equitable, but also thinking about, so for example, comedy isn't funded through the Arts Council, so thinking about other forms of funding that could kind of maybe redress that balance a little bit.
And I guess at the current time, it's of more importance than ever. I'm guessing, with no stand-up, very little stand-up comedy on because of the pandemic. Yeah,
absolutely. It's come at, it's a very weird time to start a project like this. So there's been a few things that I think has really brought this to the fore. One is sort of set up with the Live Comedy Association, which is kind of an industry body which aims to kind of basically look for more support for the industry. And they did a report that basically found that the industry has just been decimated. Historically, the people that can make it through the other side of that tends to be people that have got kind of resources that mean that they don't have to rely on comedy solely for their income, or that they can basically wait it out. And historically, that's tended to be people from privileged backgrounds that have got alternative forms of income that can keep them going, which means that we run the risk of losing a lot of working class voices, a lot of women's voices, a lot of kind of voices of people of colour, just because, there's only so long you can kind of hold on before you have to kind of just say, this is not doable.
Yeah, I can't remember the comedian I heard talking about this, but they said, for example, if you want to do a season at the Edinburgh, in August, then you have to accept your first year, maybe first 5 years, you lose money. Now, if you've got the financial support to be able to do that, then fine. But for the majority of people, they just cannot afford to make that loss.
Yeah, so Edinburgh, it can cost easily £8,000 to £10,000 to take a show up to the Fringe, because there's huge amounts of cost, kind of the venue, tech, PR, if you want to get people to actually come to your show and review it, and then accommodation in Edinburgh expensive during the Fringe. And it just means that for a lot of comedians, and a lot of working class comedians in particular, it's just not feasible, because you also got to think during that time you can't do your normal job. And there are a lot of jobs that just will not accept that you're not going to come to work for 6 weeks. So, we can see how it becomes incredibly difficult for people.
Yeah, it's also interesting, isn't it, that some of the working class comedians that do make it often make it quite late in their career, late 30s or 40s. They've been sort of standing on stage for 20 years, sort of seemingly getting nowhere, and it takes a long time to get to recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think, then that brings other forms of inequality. So if you're a woman, for example, and you want children, how sustainable is that when you've got it's a different kind of situation. Often, the things that people do to save costs become a different proposition if you're a woman. So often people will say, oh, well, you can just stay at the promoter's house. And obviously that's a different that's a different circumstance if you're a woman than it might be than if you're a man. So all of these things, I think, just entrench kind of existing inequalities, even before we think about the difficulties that people have because their actual comedy is perceived differently because of who they are. Even before we get to that point, just the kind of setup of the industry itself makes that quite difficult.
Yeah, so you integrate some of your feminism into this research as well?
I think so. I mean, not necessarily intentionally. And I think stuff with kind of gender and comedy, some of that is personal. Some of that is I have been that person that is on stage and is the only woman on the bill who is, and I've had those kind of patronising comments at the end of the night from people. And I've been in those environments where the other comedians on the set are kind of saying things that I find quite kind of sexist and kind of misogynistic. So some of it I think definitely comes from that. But yeah, it's not an intentional kind of, wasn't a decision that I made. I think it's just something that came quite kind of naturally.
Thank you, Claire. And I wondered if I could ask you one last question based on what you just said and your book. Where do you think feminism is at the moment? What kind of state do you think it's in? Because there's huge amounts of discussions on things like Twitter. I was really intrigued to know where you think we're at the moment.
Yeah, we're at a very interesting place where on the one hand, this is obviously anecdotal, but my experience of teaching, for example, so teaching feminism to undergraduate students, when I first started doing that maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I really, really struggled to get students to kind of call themselves feminists. Yeah. Really struggle. And a lot of the kind of narratives about, well, we don't need it anymore. It's kind of, it's unnecessary. We're still circulating. I don't find that so much now. I find that a lot of my students are coming into the university and they already had a really good understanding of feminism, which suggests to me that it's much more, it's being circulated much more within kind of, social media, which I think is a really good thing. The flip side of that, especially in the UK, is that we've seen a rise in kind of transphobia amongst people who identify as feminists. Which obviously for me is a really massive problem. So it's a really tricky one because I think, especially for I think younger people are embracing a much more feminist identity, which is very intersectional. Whereas there are other kind of sections of feminism which are very much not doing that. But I think it comes back to what we were saying. I think the problem is that often the people that get the visibility are those people that are kind of more reactionary, which means that if you're kind of trying to be kind of trans inclusive, you're constantly feel like you're kind of, you know, reacting to what people are saying, rather than being able to kind of just accept that kind of that trans feminism is important.
The debate that I was reading, spending far too long on Twitter the other day, was someone prominent on Twitter said that the feminist movement should just be for women and men should keep out, which caused a lot of people saying, no, no, no. We want men should be able to call themselves feminists as well. But it was a very interesting debate, actually, whether males could call themselves feminists or feminist supporters or allies, the correct terminology, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and again, like that is, you know, we have historical precedent for this. So a lot of this comes out of some of the kind of debates that people were having in the 70s about kind of, you know, whether we should have separatist movements where women completely separate themselves off from men, you know, and live just amongst other women. So this is not new in itself. I think it's a tricky one. I guess my only kind of issue with the kind of idea of men calling themselves feminists is as long as people recognise that for me, feminism is about action. So it's a doing word. So I think it's, you know, I think you might call yourself a feminist and that's absolutely fine, but you have to do something about that. And whether that's a man or a woman or a non-binary person, I think as long as the kind of actions are following through, I think I'm less bothered about whether anyone calls themselves a feminist or not, as long as they're kind of doing feminist actions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actions louder than words.
Yeah.
Thank you, Claire. Could I ask you just to tell the listeners where they can read about your work, read your book, follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, absolutely. So on Twitter, I am at Claire_Sedgwick, and in my Twitter bio, there is a link to my book, and there is also a link to a blog, which has got a bit more information about the comedy project that I'm doing. So that's probably the best place to find me.
Excellent. And let's hope comedy all get back on track pretty soon.
Yeah, hopefully.
Right. Thanks for your time today, Claire.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.